Alright, so we got video 2 now for Mardi Gras break. Give myself a reminder here. And we just talked about the excessive use of credit as one of the causes of the Great Depression. Now we're going to do the next one, which is going to be overproduction of consumer goods. Business growth, aided by increased productivity and credit use, produced a volume of goods stagnant wage earners couldn't purchase. This is another big problem. So basically, there's basically a lot of false demand. If people are buying things on credit, it seems like there's a high demand for these goods. Thus, companies kept producing more and more and more to sell more products. The problem is that they overproduce. They produce too much. People were buying stuff, but they're buying on credit, which means that companies are not really making money whenever they sold these items. So, essentially, over time, people can't afford these, and they're not going to be able to buy them. And so you have a lot of companies stuck with a lot of extra inventory, a lot of extra products, and they can't sell them. Plus, companies sell their products abroad to different countries, and if we raise our tariffs and they raise ours as well, they're not selling overseas either. So essentially, companies were producing more and more, and they got more efficient, but they weren't really watching what demand was really doing, and so they began to overproduce, and they produced way too much than was needed, and so now they're stuck with all this excess developments. Some companies took out loans, took out money to actually basically, be able to expand themselves and produce more items, which then resulted, of course, in these companies going belly up or going bankrupt once all the crash happens and so forth. The next issue is a weak farm economy. That one group that never had any 20s prosperity was the farmers. We talked about this. But because of World War I, they had overproduced. They'd taken out a lot of money and gotten into debt to basically be able to produce during the war. And so during the 1920s, all of these guys have low prices, which hurt them. They can't make their money up. And, on top of that, the government doesn't really want to help or doesn't do anything to help them out. And then on top of everything else, at the end of the 1920s and going into the 30s, you have severe drought in the Great Plains, which is going to create the Dust Bowl. And we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl later on, but that's just, makes things even worse than it already was. Then you have government policies in the 1920s. In the 1920s, government had complete faith in business and did little regulation. As we talked about, Harding, Coolidge, and Republicans in Congress, they believed that the business of America is business. And so they did basically nothing to regulate businesses at all and let these businesses get out of control. So Congress made high tariffs on top of the lack of regulations to protect U.S. industry, but it hurt international trade, and it also hurt the farmers because farmers need to sell their products to more places, to different countries. And we raise our tariffs and they raise tariff on us as well, then the farmers aren't making money whenever they sell their goods abroad either. So the government policies, the lack of regulations and high tariffs was also very hurtful towards our economy. Then you had global economic problems too. Nations were now interdependent because of international banking, manufacturing, and trade. So countries are no longer isolated like they used to be. We can't go back to 1880s and be isolated like we once were. By the 1920s, countries are now interdependent because of international banking, manufacturing, and trade. Europe was still not fully recovered in the 1920s after the war either. And so because we insisted on their debts, on Britain and France's debts being paid, and same thing with Britain and France, and we kept high tariffs, it just made things worse. U.S. loans helped Germany, but when the crash happens, those loans end in Germany and sends Germany back into a terrible state, which basically leads to the rise of the Nazis in the 1930s. And so what's important to understand here is that whenever America goes into a Great Depression, because we've now become so interdependent with other nations, that not only do we go into a depression, but other countries will as well, including nations like Germany, Britain, France, Japan, all these other nations that are going to be affected and will be involved in World War II. They will also go through a depression as well. So it's not just an American event, essentially. And we see by this happening that our markets are very much tied to each other, and you can't just basically take an isolationist approach like we thought we could. So what are the effects of all this? So complete recovery would not happen until 1939. Essentially, we're going to have a decade where the economy is going to struggle. And really not until World War II is really going on do you really see the economy rebound completely. The Great Depression forever changed American thinking and politics, even to today. You will never know a government like it was pre-Great Depression. The government before the Great Depression was usually very small. It was very uninvolved in our day-to-day life. The only way you would deal with the federal government on a day-to-day basis was like going to the post office. Other than that, you never dealt with the federal government ever. Like there was no money for education, there was no food stamps, there was none of that stuff. And that changed forever because now essentially the federal government has a much larger active role. We have all kinds of different social programming from the government. It's very involved in your day-to-day life, way more so than ever before. So the U.S. gross national product before the crash happened was $104 billion with a B. And then by 1932, our gross national product, or GNP, had fallen to $56 billion just in 4 years. The nation's income had also declined about 50% too. In 4 years, 20% of our banks closed, wiping away $10 million in saving accounts. And so in this day and age, in 1920s, if you had money in the bank and that money was there and bank closed essentially because they ran out of money, your money was gone. Like if you had $10,000 in that bank and you couldn't get it out in time, that money was gone forever. What begins to happen is what's called bank runs. This is a major effect of the crash. Is that okay? It's just like getting gas out for a hurricane. People freak out in a hurricane because they're like, oh crap, the gas station's going to run out of gas. So everybody goes and lines up for gas. When in reality, if people just went about their day-to-day lives and didn't line up and take out all the gas at once, there'd be plenty of gas for everybody to get normal gas. But everybody lines up and gets like tanks and tanks and tanks for the generators and like backup gas and gas for this and that. So the gas stations run out, essentially. Well, same things for banks. Banks don't keep all the people's money in the back of the vault. That's just impossible to do, essentially. So what banks do is basically keep enough money on hand for day-to-day operations. Well, if everybody in that bank goes and demands their money be delivered immediately, all the time at once, there's no way they can produce all that money. And so if you have hundreds of people lining up at a bank, demand they produce all their money out of it, the bank eventually runs out of money, and eventually they're going to have to close. Where's all that extra money? It's like invested in loans and like to mortgages and those kind of things. And your money is grown by the bank because of its policies. But if everybody comes demands their money out at one time, the bank can't do that. And so everybody who had money loses that money that's left over. So if you had $10,000 and got nothing out of the bank before it closed forever, you would have all your money gone. And so that's a major problem during this time period. Like I said, $10 million of money gets wiped away because of this. Also, unemployment goes up. By 1933, you have 25% unemployment. This is the highest unemployment ever gets in U.S. history. So after 4 years of the Great Depression, unemployment hits 25%, or 1 out of 4 people are unemployed, which is very high. But on the other side of that, too, think about this, that most Americans kept a job. So as you often see in movies, it seems like everybody loses their job, but in reality, most Americans actually do keep a job. Now, a lot of those Americans who were still working had their hours reduced and the wages cut, but they still were making some kind of money. And so also Republican domination of the government was also ending, and the power of federal government would also soon increase and expand. So these are some all immediate effects of the Great Depression. And it doesn't all happen at once. People don't go commit suicide, or people don't lose everything, just in one night. Some of this happens over time. And of course, homelessness increases. People begin to lose their cars. They get stuff repossessed. So it doesn't all happen at once. It might happen over several years. But basically, in those first 4 years, that's when this gets at its worst. From 1929 until 1932, those 3-4 years, that's where things get worse and worse and worse. And everything kind of bottoms out by 1932-33. So the social effects. So every class, upper to lower, felt the effects of the Great Depression. Farmers and African Americans got increased difficulty because their lives were already difficult. So African Americans and farmers were going to struggle even more. And whatever unemployment was for a white person, African Americans, it was way worse. Like in a city, if you had 25% unemployment for a white person, it could be closer to 50% for a black person in the city. Because obviously, if there's a scarcity of jobs, they're not going to get it out to black people. Poverty and homelessness increased. People lost their jobs, lost money, and so they ended up on the streets, which added a lot of stress on the family. So they might have lived in parks, they may have lived in alleyways and sewer pipes, storm pipes, whatever the case is, to basically live in shelter. A lot of people who ended up being homeless lived in what's called little shantyvilles or Hoovervilles. So a shantyville or Hooverville, where people live in these little, like, they would go into public parks and create these giant, like, little towns, essentially. They would take scrap metal or scrap wood, where they can find, and build these little homes out of, and that's what they live in. And so they would call them Hoovervilles for the disgust of what Hoover was not doing for them. No one blamed Hoover for the Great Depression because it wasn't his fault, but people did blame Hoover for not doing enough. Because Hoover, and we're going to talk about this more later on, but basically, it appeared that Hoover did not care enough to fix their problems, essentially. So Hoover, so they call them Hoovervilles. People who would cover up at night with newspapers call them Hoover blankets. You would see people walking on the streets with their pockets turned out, showing that they were poor. These were called Hoover flags. So lots of ways to show your disgust with the president and his inability to help solve the crisis. There's a lot of psychological stress that happens as well. Men couldn't deal with not working, because the whole purpose of being a man and kind of having a family is to be the breadwinner. And so if you're a man, you can't basically provide basic needs for your family. You feel like you're not a man. And so you see a lot of guys who struggle with that. Some might commit suicide. Some might just walk away from, who might just kind of freeze up, don't work at all, who just don't know what to do with themselves. And everybody kind of reacts to crisis in different ways. Some people will get right at it and will keep working and working until they can't. Some people just feel depressed and out of sorts and just can't do anything about anything. There's added stress on women because women were supposed to be the caretakers. Now they got to find a job too, so women have to try to find work. They might sew or sell food, whatever they can do, just to make money. But they got to take care of their kids, and so they're watching their kids struggle for food, essentially, and their kids are getting sick and are not fully healthy. So that's more stress on the women. Kids, they'll suffer from lack of food, like malnutrition. They'll get diseases like rickets disease, where basically you have underdeveloped bone structure. Some older kids, like your age, like teenagers, realize the burden they are to their families. So you see kids like 12, 13 years old who just run away. They'll just basically run away and go off and try to go find food or jobs elsewhere to make money on their own because they realize that their parents can't take care of them. And some men did the same thing. Some men couldn't take care of their families and couldn't deal with the psychological stress, so they just walked away. They just left their families. You see a lot of hobos, a lot of people traveling across the country looking for work. Do I have a picture of this? No. People just traveling across all the country looking for jobs, looking for work. So hobos, which stands for homeward bound, looking for places to go and places to stay. Mortgages and foreclosures become common. Suicide rates increase. People going to mental hospitals increase. People stop trusting banks, obviously. All these are direct effects, social effects of the Great Depression. So we're going to stop there, and we'll answer any questions you may have on Thursday, and then we'll finish up with Hoover and then finish up this unit Thursday and be good to go for the test on Friday. So have a good break.